CMMS Radio talks about all things CMMS, computerized maintenance management software, focused on maintenance management. It's the people, the process, and the culture that make your CMMS journey a success. Welcome back to CMMS Radio. If you're not watching on screen, that guy is Erik Hupje, and we are going to carve it up once again based on a post that he put out a couple of weeks ago. And the first thing I recognized in it was DuPont, and what it was is where do most failures come from? And what we're going to talk about a little bit today is some work that was done by Winston Ledet. I think that's the correct way to pronounce it. But Erik, you and I were just talking about it. So first of all, welcome back to CMMS Radio.
Thanks, Greg. Great to be back. Yeah, and always good to have a chat.
Oh, and for me, the most important thing about it is people get to hear from you, and I so appreciate all of your different perspectives. But this one right here caught my attention, not just because of where the research was done and what it was based on, but you and I were just talking about there's kind of some rich history behind how this came into existence. And then I want to get into a little bit about, I'm really after getting to that 84% number, which is shocking. So go ahead and tell me a little bit about Winston Ledet.
Yeah, so I came across Winston's work years ago after I had learned through painful experience kind of the power of defect elimination. But Winston Ledet worked for DuPont, and in the late 1980s, early 1990s, they did one of the biggest benchmarking studies that was ever done for maintenance. And I think they used A.T. Kearney to help with that. And they analyzed 140 or so assets worldwide, US, Japan, and Europe. So they analyzed those manufacturing plants, and they basically found that about the majority of them were in the reactive state, and they were basically having uptimes of about 80%, 83%. But the best of the best were achieving uptimes of 98%. And the reason that the difference, what they found was that the key difference between that were the plants that were achieving 98% were doing that by focusing on planning and scheduling, predictive and preventive maintenance, and defect elimination. And they even quantified the different values of each of the steps. Now, Winston Ledet went on to develop the manufacturing game, which is still in existence nowadays. So if you ever want to kind of roll out defect elimination, reach out to the guys from manufacturing game. It's a really interesting game that teaches the value of defect elimination. It's actually run, as far as I understand, still by Winston's daughter, Michelle Ledet. So it's still running, and it's a fantastic tool. And one of the key things that also came out of that research was where defects come from, and basically that's where the ABCs of failure that I mentioned in that chart came from.
Yeah, and the one I'm most interested in is the letter C, and the reason I want to focus in on that is, you know, I talk to a lot of people in the industry, amazing practitioners. One of my friends, his name's Joe Anderson, and he's with Reliability X. I know you know them, and they know you as well. And one of the things he and I have talked about is where a lot of these failures, if you will, come from. And I think that letter C, where it's essentially 84%, it's essentially operator issues and how things are being done, less than what's not being done. So could you talk a little bit more about that? And what I'm really after is, why is that number so big still to this day, and why do organizations struggle to fix it?
Good question, difficult one to answer. But yeah, let's go back to the numbers. So what Winston Ledet said found was that if you look at where the defects come from, basically what his research showed was that about 4% of defects were down to aging, and 12% was basic wear and tear, and 84% was what he called careless work habits. Now, I'm not a native English speaker, as you can hear from my accent, but I find the word careless a little bit, I think it's a little bit unfortunate because it implies that people don't care. And what Winston was what they were really saying here, this is people who are not really doing work to the level of quality that should have been done. right? So we're doing something, when we're installing something, we're not doing it correctly. It could be because the person hasn't been trained to actually install that bearing that way, right? Or it could be that an engineer is specifying a certain material be used, but it's actually the wrong material. And therefore that leads to corrosion or cracking down the line, and we've got an issue. So the careless piece is all about basically when we're not taking enough care, when we're doing work not well enough, that then introduces defects. And those defects can be in all kinds of shapes and forms. I think it's important to realize that it goes well beyond the frontline operators or the technicians. These careless work habits are, not perpetuated, but introduced through engineers, managers who make poor decisions, contractors, HR who clamp down on training costs for the technicians to say, hey, they don't need to be retrained in laser alignment. They did that 5 years ago. What's changed or whatever,
Yeah.
So there's a lot of different aspects to it, which I think that's also why it's probably quite hard to clamp down on. But a lot of it comes ultimately down to quality of work.
Do you think it's one of these? It's a big issue. There's so many areas where you can attack it and start to work on it and fix it, and that in and of itself can be disruptive, although necessary. And sometimes the pain's not great enough to fix it, or it's such a heavy lift that they have to find a way to live with these things that they can't fix. And sometimes that's the way forward, I suppose. But do you think that it's kind of a known thing that those are the areas, and it's just too big at this point to fix organization by organization?
I think that ABC's of failure, to be honest, is not as well known as it should be. I think a lot of Winston Ledet's work actually isn't as well known as it should be, including that chart where he showed the value of the different elements that they bring, the value of planning and scheduling and preventive maintenance and defect elimination. I think that's largely overlooked. It's one of the reasons we have it included in our framework, because I think it's very powerful and it's very true. It resonates with my own experience. But I think the 84% is such a big number, and it's such a diverse group of things. It's really hard to get your arm around and solve, right? So I think it's good as a concept to keep in mind to say, hey, all the defects we're seeing out there in the plant, the vast majority of them, that's us. It's what we have done, or it's what we haven't done. It's not because the machine is old or things just sometimes fail. Yeah, they do, but that's not usually the case. It's because we haven't done something, or we have done something. And so I think the probably the better approach is to really start looking, okay, well, where are the failures happening? What are the defects? What are our bad actors? And systematically identify those and then systematically tackle them.
Now, this leads me to another topic I wanted to bring up today, and I think I gotta double check a note that I had on this so that I'm not doing complete guesswork on it. But we were having a little bit of a back and forth on, I think it was RCM, and how some organizations might want to introduce or bring in a reliability centered maintenance program, and there's some that actually should not. Now, I know that's kind of a pretty hard segue, but am I remembering that little bit of a back and forth we had where sometimes these practices are being brought in and it's too soon, or maybe not even applicable to the environment?
Yeah, so I think RCM is indeed a bit of a different sidestep, right? But I think with a lot of these things, you need to have a level of understanding of what it is, right? And you need to apply it in the right context, in the right setting. So reliability centered maintenance is really a methodology for developing and optimizing your preventive maintenance program, right? When you go out on the web, you'll see all kinds of wild and wonderful definitions of what RCM is, and people misuse the term all the time. But it's actually documented through international standards what it now is. I think most people know that it originated in the airline industry, but really it's a framework for developing and optimizing your PM program. And ideally, it's something you do early. Ideally, you'd start with it in the design phase so you can actually influence your design, all right? But the key thing is it's a pretty intense process. It requires a level of understanding to facilitate and to implement. And most RCM practitioners themselves will tell you that, hey, this is not something you do in all your equipment because it's a lot of work. What you do is you typically do it on your most troublesome equipment, your most painful equipment, or your most critical equipment. That's where you do your detailed RCM analysis. But you need to have a level of maturity and understanding. So, for example, one of the things I always discuss with students and work with clients is say, whether you do RCM or FMEA or PMO or any of those kind of optimization methodologies, before you start, you need to make sure that people who are involved understand the principles that sit underneath it. Because if you don't understand the principles, then you're actually not going to make good decisions throughout the process. And so I always recommend that the people who go into those workshops to analyze the PMs and make decisions, they've got to understand, the different failure curves, what a hidden failure is, and what a random failure is, and all those kind of things, so that they can identify them and then say, right, okay, now we know it's a hidden failure mode, so therefore we've got to do a function test. Simple things, but a lot of organizations actually don't have that knowledge where it matters, and therefore they might kick off an RCM project, and very often they don't get the result. The other big problem is very often the RCMs fall flat at the execution phase. I see a lot of organizations who basically go and do a lot of analysis. They'll do an RCM, and they'll do another RCM, and they'll do another RCM, and they have all these big RCM documents and spreadsheets and everything else. But nothing is changed in the CMMS, so you don't get any benefit.
So when we talk about that, and I know I created like a huge chasm between what we started talking about and what we switched to, but you mentioned the CMMS and all these good practices when it comes to analyses and gathering of information that is actionable. It starts to fall apart on the action step. They don't move into execution, and I often wonder myself what holds them back. And equally as often, I lean on this concept that they're just not in a position to slow down and do it right, even though they know they need to. And I often wonder, where does somebody start if they keep getting these good analyses that provide this information? Where do they start to turn that corner and actually execute to implement solutions?
I think it's a couple of things. One is you need to set up your improvement project slightly different. We'll come to that. The second is you need to involve the right people from the beginning. So when you do an RCM project, for example, or any kind of maintenance improvement project, when you're looking to optimize your maintenance strategy, so the tasks that you do, your PMs, right? You obviously need to involve your engineers, your reliability engineers, etc. You need to involve your technicians and operators who come from the front line and tell you what's actually happening out there, not just what's on paper, but what they're really doing and what they're really seeing, because there's often a big difference between the two. But then the third group is you need to have the people who are actually going to implement this in your CMS. Because if you don't involve them from the beginning and they don't understand, and they can, for example, provide you the templates to use and everything else, they might get a whole bunch of documents at the end. They're like, okay, now what? We're going to have to modify all this and put this into templates, and we've got already so much work, and they haven't been involved, so they don't really care too much, etc. So that's one key thing, is involve the right people, and so you have things set up for a proper workflow. The other key thing is, and I see a lot of, this is really important in my view, is when you kick off a project, you do one system at a time. So you identify a system or a piece of equipment, whatever, you say, hey, we're going to optimize this one. You run your workshop, you identify the failure modes, your mitigating tasks, you write your work instructions, you then sit down and discuss and agree how you're going to structure this in your CMS. Then you put it in your CMS and you turn it on. And only then do you start optimizing system or equipment number 2. Right. So you do, sprint wise, basically equipment by equipment wise or system by system wise, rather than doing, analysis, and then implementation, because that usually doesn't then happen. Right. And it's a bit the same with RCAs. Now I'm making the segue, but we see the same with RCAs, where a lot of analysis happens, but then the action in the field doesn't happen. And guess what? You don't get the benefit from your RCAs either. And it's the same with these RCM or other PM optimization methodologies.
I wonder, as you're describing that, because RCA is an absolute necessity in certain environments, maybe all of them at some point. And I'm trying to figure out, I think we all are, who owns this within the organization. And I think the answer is, it's not a singular individual. It's not a singular department. Unless, right, there might be some context around, well, it's related to this board meeting or it's related to this thing in quality. But we're always going to tend to fall back to these systems, these approaches, RCA, RCM, all of it are phenomenal. But if you don't set the stage, if you don't set the foundation, if you don't have buy-in across the board, and all of these things are buzzwords at this point. And the thing I'm getting at is, if the people, all the right people, like you said, are involved, and now we can own it as a group so that everybody's kind of helping one another out, but they're in it for the right reasons. That's the way forward. It's not going to fall on one person's shoulders. And sometimes organizations try to put it on one person or one department's shoulders. Am I getting that kind of right? Or is there 1,000 ways to slice it?
I'm sure there is 1,000 ways to slice it, but I think fundamentally, these things, they need to be business processes, right? So there's one of the things I focus on a lot with my clients. I say, hey, whether it's planning and scheduling, root cause analysis, or defect elimination, however you want to frame it, they are slightly different, but or optimizing your PMs, it needs to be a process that gets executed by roles in your organization. It's not Joe's responsibility to optimize your PM program. That will never work, right? So it needs to be a process that has a clear beginning and clear end, that's owned by certain people, that's executed the same way by everyone, and it's documented, etc. And that applies for all of them, including the RCA. And then you have within that process, you'll typically have a coordinator who pulls people together. You have different stakeholders. And that's the key thing, is you need to set it up as a business process that is owned by somebody. One of the other things we always encourage is say, once you have the process defined and documented and rolled out, one of the key things you need to have is what we call a process owner, who owns the quality of the process and make sure that the process is actually effective. And then the rest of the organization is responsible for actually executing the process. And then you get a nice tension between people saying, hey, I've done what's in the process, I'm not getting the result. Well, then it's up to the process owner to say, hey, obviously we've got a gap in the process is not right. But if people are saying, hey, we're not getting the result, and they're not doing the process, well, then the first step is stick to the process, right? Execute what we've agreed, do that. So that's one of the key things we work on. That's how you get things more sustainable. Yeah, for sure.
Do you think it seems to me it might be, I'm not sure, but it's somewhat common that people that don't understand, for example, maintenance, reliability, asset management, why we do the things that we do to, ultimately create more throughput, safer environments, all of this, where we might get project managers that are put on these different tasks that we're talking about and describing that don't really know why they're doing what they're doing. Is that a common practice still at this point, where, there's bodies, there's people doing the job, but they don't know why, and how important is it that they do? I hope that question kind of makes sense.
Yeah, so I think there's two things that jump out to me there in that question. The last bit is the why. I think it's really important when you roll out a process or ask people to do a certain piece of work that they understand why they need to do that work, how it fits in the bigger picture, and why that work is important. Because once people understand what they need to do, how they need to do it, and why they need to do it, you very often find that they will do it. Most people come to work wanting to do a decent job. Yeah, I know it's not everyone, but usually the problems in most organizations is not because the organization is filled with a lot of bad people who don't want to work, right? It's because the systems are broken, the processes are broken, people don't understand what they need to do or why they need to do it, etc. So I think the why is really important. Once people understand their role in the bigger picture, most people will want to contribute. So I think that's really important. Secondly is, I do think there is a lot of people who have been placed into roles without actually really any kind of guidance, mentoring, training, background understanding of what it is they have to do and why that is important and how to do it. So another classic process, planning and scheduling. I mean, I don't know how many planners and schedulers around the world are in a role who've never had formal planning and scheduling training, but it's a lot, right? It's a large number, and most of them end up in the role for a range of reasons, and they learn from whoever was in the role before. Right, so you get this kind of tribal knowledge, tribal way of doing things that could be good, but it could also be maybe not so good, or it could have been good 10 years ago when the organization was structured in a different way and it was a different size and operating in a different way, but it's no longer a suitable way of running it. So I think competency development, training, knowledge, etc., is a big issue across many industries, many organizations.
Yeah, I've been kind of, I don't know if fascinated is the right word, but I'm going to use it, kind of fascinated with this idea of people that run companies that have to do with maintenance and reliability, asset management, and then people throughout management structures. How much do they really know about what they're doing for others? And a lot of times they don't know everything, but I don't know that they have to. What you said about understanding the why and what this is connected to, that has to be there, because it's not just a bunch of, Lego parts you throw on the floor and have fun with it. If a kid didn't know what a Lego was, he might be throwing them at a wall. He doesn't know he's supposed to put stuff together. But it's just one of those things. That's why I say fascinated. Like, I'm always kind of thinking about it. Are we asking for too much? Are we pushing for too little when it comes to these concepts of leadership, team buy-in, building out the fundamental excellence that we need in order to be a strong group? And we could spin out from here in a lot of ways. So I'm going to change this up, and I'm going to add another topic to our discussion: the concept of wrench time.
Mm.
I would like to know from you, when I say we need more wrench time, and pretend I don't know what I just said, but I said it. What did I mean? What was I talking about?
Okay, so the way I look at wrench time, and I think most people do, is wrench time basically is a reflection of how much time of the day your technicians actually spend on the tools doing the maintenance work that you've hired them for, right? Um, so if you look at a typical day for most maintenance technicians, that time that they spend on the tools doing productive maintenance without looking for parts or waiting for instructions or waiting for an isolation or waiting for a permit to work or any of those kind of delays is typically 25 to 35%, right? That's industry average. We keep finding that. And, you ask any of the previous names you've mentioned, typically those are the kind of numbers you see. And that's really low. If you think about it, on a 10-hour day, that means you get about 3 hours of maintenance out of a technician, right? So you've hired all these maintenance technicians to do work, right? To do maintenance work, but you've set up a system that makes it so hard for them to do their work that they only spend 3 hours out of the 10 hours doing actual maintenance work, hands-on tools time, as others call it. And that's too low.
So the reason I ask is because I think sometimes there's a misconception when the word wrench time is used. It means something very specific, and it has little or nothing to do with repair work. Wrench time in this context, and when you say wrench time, you're talking about maintenance activities. That's the wrench time that you're talking about. But every once in a while, someone might say, no, you don't want more wrench time. That means you have too much breakage. But wrench time in this context has got nothing to do with repairs. It has to do with maintenance. Yeah. And that's kind of why I brought it up. I kind of wanted to, have everybody get the popcorn out and take a dig.
Yeah, so it's basically wrench time is a very loaded word for a lot of reasons, right? Because historically, it's been measured and assessed in some pretty awful ways, which can be very counterproductive. There's been plenty of organizations in the past who've blamed low wrench time or low productivity on the individual workers, say, hey, you're not working hard enough, etc. Right? But ultimately, wrench time is a measure of your productivity, and it's an indication of how much waste you have in your execution process, right? So if you think lean, if you think the concepts that come from the Toyota production system, basically, you want to eliminate all that waste, right? So planning and scheduling is actually a tool for eliminating the waste during execution, because the whole idea is with planning, you identify all the things that the technician needs to have in place to do a job, right? So whether it's the part or the special tools or procedures or instructions or access or another external resource or higher equipment, all that gets identified through planning. And then you make sure through a combination of planning and scheduling that all that is in place when the technician is arriving on site to go and do the job. So he or she can do the job with minimal delays. That's the whole
Yeah.
point of planning and scheduling, and that's how you eliminate the waste. There are a few people who keep saying, look, wrench time is an old-fashioned concept. It is dangerous. It is negative, and blah, blah, blah. My view is very simple. Wrench time is really just a measure or an indication of how productive you are and therefore how much waste you have in your process. There is nothing old-fashioned about eliminating waste. That's what we should be doing in business at all times. The question is how you use wrench time, how you assess it. There's no point in measuring wrench time every week or every month because things don't improve that fast. Once a year is probably more than enough. Second, most organizations, there's no point in doing a wrench time study or a detailed assessment because if your wrench time is 25 to 30%, all you need to do is get your technicians and your supervisors and your operators and a few other people to sit around a table and have a good, honest conversation about, hey, out of the 10 hours a day, where does it typically go? And after an hour or two, you probably have a pretty good estimate of what your wrench time really is. So you don't need to spend 2 weeks with a bunch of consultants to do a detailed assessment, following people and all that kind of stuff. Not necessary, because your wrench time is not great. When you're getting close to world-class performance, yeah, maybe that's what you want to do. But for most organizations, it's not necessary.
Yeah, I've got like all kinds of alarm bells going off in my head when we talk about the time that gets dedicated to doing that properly and whether you need it. And then I'm thinking about all these technologies out there that promise, these green pastures and magic silver bullets that are going to help you solve these problems with technology. And what you described was a very basic but high impact tool or technique or thing where you get together and talk it out openly and honestly. And now you can see where all those time sucks, is what I used to call them, are showing up, where you have technicians, maybe not literally sitting around, but they're not able to do anything. It's no different than, if you had a bunch of firefighters and you said, yeah, you guys got to wait until 3:00 to go attack that fire. And it's only 12:30. They're just sitting around, so to speak. Right. I don't know. I don't want to spin out too much on it, but I really wanted to bring in the wrench time discussion so that we could get a little bit better understanding of what it actually is and why it really matters. So I want to ask you, I know you're just starting your day, and I want to know if you can share what's the latest kind of problem, trend, or issue that you're excited to be involved in solving right now. You don't have to name any clients or anything like that, but is there anything that's kind of hot on your mind right now that Erik is just like, yeah, I'm wrestling with this again today, and it's a really good thing because it's going to result in X, Y, or Z?
Look, to be honest, we're focusing primarily on the same things, right? Improving productivity through better planning and scheduling, helping people eliminate repeat failures through defect elimination, getting people to write better PM programs through, understanding the principles under RCM, etc. So those are the kind of core things. There's a couple of kind of key themes that are coming back. More and more helping clients with actually sorting out their management system. So there's some consulting work there to basically help set up their maintenance management system and the documentations and the processes, because unless they do that, they'll never get forward. But we also keep seeing the same kind of problems coming back. And one of the things that's interesting and has got me kind of thinking again recently is certain industries have been pushing quite hard towards the concept of remote planning, for example. Right. And I've been scratching my head around that for years, like how that really works. We've done it in oil and gas to some degree, but we always had a planning capacity on the asset. Yeah, we had remote planners who would do the more complex work or very specialized. You can't have an expert rotating planner on every single offshore platform, so you centralize that, etc. But you see some organizations, some industries say, no, we do all our planning remote. I'm like, how the heck does that work, right? So through some interesting conversations and observations, we're starting to see that what people really do is they actually push that piece of work to somebody else. Essentially, in this case, this is frontline technicians. So it's very interesting to see that what you see people saying, oh, we do it differently. Well, actually, no, you just pushed it to somewhere else in the organization, right? And that's a very interesting concept. What you see with a lot of things when people say, oh, we don't do that, we do this. And then eventually you start unpacking, you see, yeah, no, hold on. It's still the same principle. You've just moved it to somewhere else. So yeah, anyway, that's a bit of a vague answer, but we keep coming back to the same core principles of planning and scheduling, defect elimination, preventive maintenance. Those are the things we work on. That's what I still get excited about, because I know that makes a big difference.
Well, and this is the reason I wanted to ask something like that you could do anything you wanted with on the answer, was just to get a little glimpse of kind of what makes you excited and intentional about what you do on a day-to-day basis as an individual, as well as the organization, and helping people with all these things. It's good stuff for people to hear about, to help them maybe think a little bit differently, or oftentimes actually agree. Yep, I agree with that too. And the messages don't change all that much. There's not going to be a lot of new stuff. They're going to change the names. They're going to use different acronyms. And of course, we've got all kinds of craziness going on in the industry as a whole right now as to, the technology and all that. And we're not going to say it because we haven't said it on this episode. So this is going to be a very special episode where we didn't say it. You know what it is. Erik Hupje, I want to thank you once again for being here with me on CMMS Radio. Everyone out there, there's a great article on defect elimination, why you can't do without, and that's on reliabilityacademy.com. You can find it. I'm going to try to drop that link for this episode. But Erik, thanks for being with me again. This was really fun.
Oh, thanks, Greg, for having me. I always enjoyed the conversation, so thank you very much.
You got it. Did you find this episode helpful? Please send us some feedback, suggest a topic, or ask a question. Reach out to CMMS Radio if you need a co-pilot on your CMMS project. Visit CMMSradio.com and use the What's on Your Mind link. Thank you for tuning in to CMMS Radio, your resource for all things CMMS, from selection to implementation, to help you make better choices, learn from industry experts, and have a successful CMMS journey.